Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Scott Campbell, president of the Howard Baker Forum and co-founder with Bill Deckelman of the AI Collaborative. The AI Collaborative is a new global association of business executives, of policy experts, and technologists poised to monitor and assess the rush of AI technology that's before us. The Howard Baker Forum, which is now in its 18th year, is a respected convener of bespoke public policy, government and business roundtables, conferences, and consortiums over the years. And we've done, high performance computing, laser fusion, fracking, the cybersecurity issues, small fast reactor technologies, but no technology we've looked at before has had the propensity, the velocity, the transforming power of AI. So today we welcome you and welcome you to take a look at our global collaboration as we hear from leading voices on the AI revolution. And if you're interested in joining, of course, please visit our website afterwards at theaicollab.org. If you're interested in learning more, just want to join, please let us know. But let's go ahead and get started with our program, and I'll turn it over to Bill Deckelman. Bill?
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. And let me add my welcome to our audience, our guest speakers, sponsors, and our advisory board members. This is our inaugural virtual salon event, so it's great to have each and every one of you join us for what we believe is not only an important and highly informative discussion today, but it also represents the beginning of a global conversation that we will all learn and benefit from immensely in the coming months. So we're very excited to have you all. Let me take just a few minutes, if I could, to give an overview of the AI Collaborative. As the name suggests, the central focus of this program will be artificial intelligence and the related emerging technologies. It's very intentionally designed to be highly collaborative and to present opportunities to build global relationships with peers and thought leaders who are passionate about gaining a fact-based and practical understanding of what AI is, the risk and opportunities surrounding it, and how it is already impacting and is likely to impact our world in the future. This is the world of global business, commerce, trade, and the economy, the world of governments, legislation, regulation, geopolitics, security, national security, and cybersecurity, military and defense, and much more. So what is the context for the AI Collaborative and why is it important now? Well, I think the answers to this audience are probably very much self-evident. I would venture to say that none of us in our lifetimes have seen the uncertainty at the scale and scope that we are experiencing today. In fact, at this point, I would say that the word uncertainty is just about completely worn out. You hear it all the time, but it is real, and it is reality that we all deal with. As leaders in business, governments, politics, policy, military, government bodies, and academia, nonprofits, NGOs, we all have our stakeholders. And those stakeholders are looking to leadership to guide and navigate through all this uncertainty in ways that will maximize opportunities and success and minimize surprises and failure. So to execute, leaders must have accurate and actionable knowledge and information. Of course, there's a lot that could be said about where we are today and how we got here, but let me quickly highlight 3 points that I think are particularly relevant to the AI Collaborative. First, what underlies all this uncertainty is a lot of complexity. There are a multitude of variables and vectors that can cause or impact outcomes. They can operate together or they can operate independently. They can cascade in surprising ways. And as the multitude continues to grow, so does volatility. Second, a key contributor to this extreme uncertainty is the unprecedented and accelerating advancement of technology. Undoubtedly, AI is top of the list today, and along with advancements in things like robotics and physical AI, military and space technologies, quantum computing, to name just a few, virtually every aspect of our lives will be changing dramatically in the coming years. And third, as a global economy and market, We are highly interconnected and interdependent through technology. And as we have all witnessed, this brings with it incredible opportunities and incredible risks. The bottom line is leaders understandably struggle to understand the complexity of this global ecosystem in which traditional paradigms may no longer apply. How do all the dots and threads connect and interrelate? How do leaders put all this together to inform their strategies? This is the purpose of the AI Collaborative, to convene senior executives, board members, government and policy officials, thought leaders, to form a resource network of peers and experts that can present and discuss these issues and deliver practical awareness, intelligence, and insights that are critical for success in today's world. We've structured the AI Collaborative to be very diverse in terms of global reach of our members, our advisory board members, and our sponsors, and also in terms of organizational areas of responsibility and expertise. We want a healthy cross-section of participants and perspectives as we tackle these challenges. We're also very fortunate to have Chatham House as our research partner and global policy advisor. You'll hear more from them later, but suffice to say they need little introduction to this audience. I'm sure they are, without a doubt, a leading independent policy institute based out of London and renowned for their impartiality and for fostering open and candid dialogue on important global policy issues, and for rigorous research and analysis, all those things that we definitely want to emphasize in the collaborative. In addition, we'll be hosting regular virtual salon events and looking for opportunities for peer-to-peer meetings and discussions with subject matter experts, policymakers, and regulators. Our members will receive regular updates with relevant news, trends, and insights. And finally, we have an outstanding advisory board supporting the AI Collaborative, made up of preeminent leaders and subject matter experts globally who will be guiding us and contributing to the program in very valuable ways. Our goal here, quite simply, is to provide a world-class global forum with real impact for our members. And we certainly look forward to speaking with you more in the coming days about this. Thank you, and let's jump right into the program now. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Tara Rigler, who serves as Vice President, Communications and Public Affairs for the Special Competitive Studies Project, which she joined in 2021. Prior to that, Tara served as the Director of Strategy, Communication, and Engagement at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, NSCAI. And prior to joining NSCAI, Tara was appointed to the Senior Executive Service and served as the Assistant Director for Communications for the Bureau of Land Management, in addition to many other senior communication roles during her 22 years of federal service. So Tara, thank you for joining us today, and I will turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Bill, and it's great to be joining everybody today in this first meeting as we kick things off. So it is my delight to introduce Ylli Bajraktari. So I met Ylli 15 years ago when I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy spokesperson, and he was the country director for the Afghanistan portfolio at the Pentagon. And so I've been really lucky to have worked with him with a total of 7 jobs. So when he reached out to me in 2019 about a commission he was leading, I was of course intrigued. How could I not be? Everything always happens around Ylli. So who else would send an email saying, hey friend, I know you're enjoying your job at the Bureau of Land Management, but how would you like to become part of the future? I'd never been a part of the future, so of course I said yes. So prior to launching SCSP, Ylli served as the Executive Director of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and prior to that, he joining NSCAI, or starting NSCAI, he was H.R. McMaster's Chief of Staff, where I was also very fortunate to work with him there. And he's held a variety of leadership roles at the Pentagon. So I think to set the stage for today's conversation on the global state of play in artificial intelligence, risk and opportunities, I'd like to start by asking Ylli to share with us how he first became interested in AI, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and how SCSP came about, and then how the landscape has changed since 2018, because I think it's pretty remarkable. So, Ylli, over to you.
Thanks, Tara, for that kind introduction, and good to be here with AI Collaborative. Thank you so much for joining. I got into the AI world by purely working for incredible leaders, and one of them is Bob Work, who used to serve as the Deputy Secretary of Defense from 2014 to 2017. And some of the best and probably the initial projects in AI related to the Pentagon were launched by him. He was a big believer in AI. I knew nothing about AI, but you know, his belief that AI really will be transformative technology that will ultimately impact warfare really led us to drive forward some of the initiatives we did in the Pentagon in that space. After the Pentagon, I spent some time at the National Defense University, where I had time to really deep down in terms of what AI is from the technical perspective. This is 2017 and 18, when I think there were only 5 books about AI. This is at the time when Kai-Fu Lee came out with the superpower book. So I got more into AI, and then unbeknownst to me, Congress at that same time created an AI commission that you and I both served. But I wanted to give a little bit of background about why this came about in 2018, because I think now everybody knows AI. We're all using it one way or another. But I think for the first time, maybe in recent history, Congress had a foresight to create a commission to look at an issue that it's coming, not to look backwards at something that went wrong. These commissions are usually created to investigate what went wrong. I think 9/11 is the most famous commission. But I think Congress in 2018 was hearing a lot from the Silicon Valley leaders that there is a really powerful technology coming. It's transformative. It's once in a generation, and we're not organized for that. And then the second thing that I think happened in 2017 and 18 was that we finally understood the real intentions of China. Up to that moment, I think we were hoping that the rise of China would be different, that China will rise and become a responsible stakeholder in the international scene. But in 2017 and 18, you start to see the real face of China. You know, they start unveiling these strategies, one of them being AI, where they say they're going to be the global AI leader in 2030. On our side, under the Trump 1 administration, the national security strategy calls China a competitor for the first time, probably in our national security strategy documents. So there's a sense that now we have to deal with a competitor that not only is a competitor, in the economic space, soon to be a military space, but the major component of that competition really revolves around technology and specifically about AI. And so with that, Congress created the commission that you and I served, and it was led by Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, and Bob Work was the deputy. We were really fortunate to have Safra Catz from Oracle in that commission, Andy Jassy, who at that time was the CEO of AWS, but now he's the CEO of Amazon. But in recent history, that also is maybe an effort by Congress to create a mini public-private effort to look at something that is happening in private sector, but that our government is really not organized for, nor we have a vision of how to handle. When you think about it, during the Cold War, most of the innovation came from government labs. You know, we have DARPAs of the world and whatnot. But since the end of the Cold War, innovation moved to private sector. You see increase in terms of the R&D spending that the tech companies were doing. You saw innovation coming from private sector. So I think in 2018, Congress really with this AI commission created this public-private entity to look at what are departments and agencies doing with AI and what do we need to do to be organized. I'm going down this rabbit hole because this is the thick report that we produced. It's 759 pages. And I don't think this report will go down as another report in our history because so far we have about 111 pieces of legislation that Congress passed based on this report. And we basically focused the 4 big pieces that we had to do in terms of our country being organized. We said that we're not organized, therefore we need to create offices that handle AI with these departments and agencies, and the White House needs to drive this forward. We pushed hard on the hardware piece, which after our report, the CHIPS Act really came to fruition. If you look at our report, those were the roots of the legislation that first was known as the China bill, and then Endless Frontier, and then it ended up being called the CHIPS Act. We argued that you need an ecosystem that is revitalized in the United States, where at the local level, private sector, academia, and government really work hand in hand for this new AI age. And the last piece, which is really also important, is the people space. As we uncovered during the AI Commission's work, the number of people that are graduating with computer science degrees is not as high as is in China. The number of people that are, that come from other countries to study here don't have the ability to stay here, although we would benefit by keeping them. I'm an immigrant, so that was a big issue for us to look into. And then lastly, we had issues of how we bring talented people inside the government to work in AI. And so this is all pre-ChatGPT era. Obviously, you and I had issues explaining to people what do we do before ChatGPT came, and I don't think now that's the case. I really believe, and doing this for 6 years now, that every 6 months when some of these tech luminaries tell me that we are only at the beginning, I'm skeptical by nature, so I never believe that. But every 6 months for the last 6 years, I've been proven wrong. Because every 6 months, these models have been more powerful, better. They have addressed problems that we have had from the beginning. I mean, if you remember at the beginning, we were talking about hallucinations. That's no longer an issue. And so I think this decade will really set the foundation of who will dominate the rest of the century. Is it going to be United States or China? And I think DeepSeek, when you look backwards, Tara, and you've heard me talk about these things, a lot of people call the DeepSeek moment the Sputnik moment. We have argued from 2018 that China almost every year had a technological innovation breakthrough. If you look at in 2017, they got ahead of us in 5G. If you look at the world 5G map today, it looks primarily red because since 2017 and 18, they doubled down on Huawei, they subsidized it heavily, and they deployed it globally. So if you look at the map, it's us, Australians, the UK that primarily doesn't use the Chinese infrastructure of Huawei to deploy 5G. In Africa, 70% of 4G is Huawei built, so I don't think Africa will have an issue upgrading their telecom systems to 5G just because China is already there. So this is a serious technological competition. I believe AI is that underlining technology that a lot of next generation technologies will spring from. And I think we have to win this technology competition by this end of this decade. We've been pretty vocal about this. I think on the political side, if there's one issue that brings Republicans and Democrats together in Congress, is the issue of technology competition with China. If you look at all the bills that were passed in the last 3-4 years under the Trump, Biden, or even today, the bills, legislation that fall under the category of how do we stay ahead when it comes to the China tech competition, those were the ones that easily passed because there's a wide consensus that we are talking about the future of our country, we're talking about the future of the world, and we don't want to cede that leadership to Chinese companies that work hand in hand with the Chinese Communist Party. But I'll stop here, Tara. I'm happy to, continue or take any questions.
Yeah, no, so Ylli, you've been closely tracking these AI developments around the world, and we are in a global competition. So where does the U.S. truly stand in this competition against China and perhaps others? And, are we ahead, are we behind, are we more nuanced?
Yeah, so this has been a question that everybody has been asking us for the last 6 years. And I'll tell you a little anecdote, which Tara, but when we took the commission to meet the intelligence community back in 2019, for private sector people, they had one question in their mind. Are we ahead or is China is ahead? And the intelligence community experts jumped off their chairs by saying no, we can't analyze the United States companies. That means we need to spy on American citizens. That's against the law, yada, yada. So we didn't have a good picture of where we are versus China in 2019. I still think we don't have a good picture of where we are versus China because this is a hard to compete and compare competition because it's not all apples to apples. We did a modest comparative analysis here now that we left government. And in some core technologies, we argue that they are ahead, like solar panels, 5G that I mentioned. Some are contested. I would put AI as contested just because it's such a dynamic competition. This competition will never have an end point in which we will say we won and they lost. Because as you can see, in January with the DeepSeek release, all of a sudden China was ahead because they came out with a better model that was much cheaper than most of our models. But that leadership was soon closed by our companies and we're still ahead. But this is a serious competitor, as I mentioned. China is a top-down country. They have put enormous resources towards technological development. Just last year, China decided to invest $800 billion in their grid. And I'm mentioning grid because the energy then, as you all know, becomes the second most important factor of who stays ahead in AI. And China realizes this. That's why they're putting enormous resources towards, energy diversification, infrastructure, and whatnot. So this is going to be an ongoing competition. For now, I think our companies are ahead. You saw the Google releasing some of the incredible models this week. But as I said, this is not a competitor that you need to underestimate because they have more computer scientists. They graduate every year than we do. They have more money to invest from the government side in their private sector because they have a civ-mil fusion where private sector works really hand in hand with government. And they have a scale. You can't compete with the scale that China has. So anytime they can release these models and they can build models and they can train them, they have a scale that we don't have in terms of population and data and whatnot.
Yeah, so going beyond China and the US, looking globally, again, global competition, what other nations or regions are quietly emerging as significant AI players? What makes their approach something that's noteworthy we could learn from, or they could learn more from us?
Yeah, that's a good question, Tara. So the project that you and I work right now takes a cue from the project that Dr. Kissinger led in the 50s called Special Studies Project, which was basically Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite, caught us by surprise. So then under his and Nelson Rockefeller's leadership, they got together and brought best and the brightest to think about how we can get ourselves organized. In the 50s, the organizing principle were the nuclear weapons. We built the nuclear deterrence in Europe with our NATO allies, and in Asia with Japan and other allies we have in the Asian Pacific. But underlying of that nuclear deterrence was the entire infrastructure, how we move. We built highways in the 50s so we can move nuclear weapons. And so that whole effort really created the necessary infrastructure, during the Cold War for us to operate together, have people-to-people exchanges, do joint R&D. I'm saying all of this because I think we're at the same point now in time in history in which we have to work with our allies and partners and new emerging, actors. You saw the president's amazing trip last week in the Middle East where, he locked a lot of these deals related to AI and the future of energy with Middle Eastern partners. And he did the right thing because, for the last couple of years, our Middle Eastern partners were really hedging. Some of them were also working with China. Some of them were working with us. And I think going forward, as I mentioned, this digital infrastructure becomes the most important necessity for who will dominate the AI future. So it's important for us to have the Middle Eastern partners in our camp, not in the China camp. Obviously, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, of all the places in the world, is the most important one. And Taiwan has multiple importances for us. Number one is TSMC, which I think everybody knows now why Taiwan is important. You and I were there in February. Taiwan is the center of democracy, center of future of technology, and a resilient population. But when you go there, you feel the constant threat that the Taiwanese are from the Chinese daily intrusions, exercises, practices, you name it. And so Taiwan really is a central hub for our future, and I think for the democracy's future. So while maybe the nuclear alliances is not replicable in today's AI world, something similar we have to think about how we build together collaboratively. So we have partners that fulfill our energy gaps. We have partners that bring in people and R&D facilities. I would remiss not to mention, but we have to work closely with Europeans. I don't think Europeans are in a good place right now when it comes to the future digital infrastructure. I think they have amazing capacities, but I think in the last couple of years, the Europeans have chosen a path of regulation, and I don't think that will bring them, to play with the big boys in this new era. So but because they are our allies, they are our biggest trading partners, we have to work with them to find a way to bring them on board so they too can be part of this new AI, digital infrastructure we have to build jointly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think too, when we talk about moving to the next part of the conversation, risks, and then, the benefits, so there's always the good and the bad and things. And we've talked about risk consistently over, the past couple of years, looking at things right now, what do you think the most significant AI risk is, and from a global perspective, and why? I think when you talk about Europe and over-regulating, that in my mind is one, but, your other perspectives, looking forward to hearing more about that.
Look, In terms of the global risk, Tara, that you're talking about, I think the biggest risk is really China getting ahead, and specifically maybe DeepSeek or any other models that they can deploy becomes the mainstream AI platform that people use it globally. People are already using DeepSeek, but we should take cue from what happened with other Chinese platforms. When you look at TikTok, when you look at WeChat, when you look at Temu and Shine, we ignored all of them because we thought, oh, these are like some cute retailing online, application. But all of a sudden, when you look at the global map, China not only has built a digital infrastructure, now they're deploying these amazing software capabilities that come in terms of, retailing or entertainment, or tomorrow in the AI. So you and I can easily wake up in 2025 through 2030 in a world in which the entire digital ecosystem is dominated by Chinese infrastructure and platforms. So that's one. I'm all about the competition, but I think open source competition, we should dominate like we're dominating in the proprietary models right now. And I think this is the one area that we should not let the scenarios of TikTok happen to us. So that's one thing. At the sort of like at the federal and state level, I think the way we build and deploy AI for government capabilities, I think should be at the forefront of our members of Congress and the cabinet members, because I think it's going to be really hard to give a one governance framework for the entire AI, just because this is a technology that is being updated daily. So we have argued that you only have to focus on high consequence cases of the AI application. Is it causing a physical harm? Is it causing economic harm? And who is from the departments and agencies applying AI for the purposes of their mission? And so the risk really varies at the level we're talking about. At the international level, obviously there's no bigger risk than China, because no matter how we talk at the federal and state level, if China wins the AI competition, then I think the rest of the conversation becomes really non-consequential for the future of our world.
Yeah, and then there's those risks also too. I mean, there are risks that you perhaps think are under discussed that have other like societal impact or economic implications globally. What do you think some of the the ones people aren't talking about that they really should be more focused on as look at the landscape?
On the risk or opportunities, or both?
The risk. Oh
yeah. So I don't know. I mean, for the last 2 years, I think the two underlying themes that dominated the risk were the cyber issues, because I think there's a sense that AI will give state, non-state actors really a powerful tool now to target what we call it macro population at the micro level, because of the ability to do micro targeting towards you, Tara, towards any of the people on the call, at much faster speed and scale that we have seen it before. So that's probably one risk. The other one was the bio risk that I think people have talked about it. But although the bio risks have always existed, you could have always found crazy people going on the dark web, finding stuff on how to build bioweapons and deploy it. And so those were, I think, two primary risks that I think the companies were really focused on. I think the previous administration was really focused on. So those are the ones that have dominated this space for the last couple of years now.
Mm-hmm. So if you were to look then at what, AI for opportunity, AI for good, there's a lot of great potential. You think about medical devices, you think about all these other things. I mean, so taking that question is asked, but looking at all the, the rest of the world, the rest of the applications, what are some of the biggest opportunities right now?
Yeah, I think, look, everybody says that this is going to be the year of the AI, agentic AI. I think if we are smart and we adopt AI for the educational purposes, it could be a game changer for our country. China is doing this. I don't have to say, everybody knows, but China is now introducing AI curriculum from the first grade of elementary. We're not there yet, but I think about it. For the first time, probably everyone can have a personalized tutor, and that would be immense in terms of how we can, scale and spread AI education in our country. I think also AI gives us another opportunity to rethink the educational system. The educational system we have was built since the industrial age. You go 4 years to college and then you go to grad school. When you look at the UK students go there for 3 years in the undergrad and then 1 year masters. I think AI maybe should open up these conversations about what kind of educational system we need for the future. the administration is focused so much on bringing the manufacturing back. But we all have to be realistic that this is not going to be the traditional manufacturing capabilities we need to bring back. We have to think about advanced manufacturing, robotics, robots, automation. When you look at China, China has gone all in robotics. Why? Because they have a demographic problem. Post 2030, they will hit a serious demographic challenge. So that's why they're going all in robotics. We had a guest speaker here who was a correspondent out of Beijing, and he said in China they produce one robot every 7 seconds. We did a big AI summit here with robotics companies we have in DC and around the nation. We barely could find 12 maybe that are viable, that are scalable, and that can produce cheap robots. So this is the future of manufacturing, but then we have to think about who are the people that are going to run these factories, not people that are going to work in manufacturing, but actually managers of these AI factories and these advanced networks and advanced manufacturing capabilities. And so I think the future of education needs to be rethink. I think my biggest concern is the future of workforce. You already see early indications that people are not hiring any more computer scientists at the level they were hiring before. The charge this year from hiring is really going down because companies now are finding that replacing humans with computer scientist skills, it's free and cheaper and better if you have an AI or agentic AI. And so we really have to think about the future workforce. This needs to be probably a Washington-led initiatives because the case, as you know, Tara, that I use is at the beginning of last century, we had candlelighters in the streets of New York that they would go every night and put light on the streets of New York City. That profession died within 5 years when the electricity was invented. And so what does that mean for now today? Where are we going to be in 5 years in terms of the workforce that we currently have versus the one we need going forward? And I think this is some of the serious things we need to think about it because it gives us an opportunity to really reskill and retrain. I mean, these are massive. There are so many. We have a course with Coursera, as you know, Tara. It's called Gen AI for National Security, where we're trying to provide an opportunity for the federal workforce to be upskilled through taking these free classes. The Coursera leader told me that they have, unlimited amount of online AI classes, but they have never seen a more enrollment in any of the trends in the last 20 years since they exist, unlike AI. They said cloud was the best one so far, but AI dwarfs cloud in comparison. And so we are there, I think. People understand this. People are worried. People are intrigued about AI. We just need sort of like a top-down approach of like how we move these massive programs towards the future.
Well, and I think too, I was talking to Scott earlier about, we're having our expo June 2nd through 4th. And, there's a great opportunity there when we look at general population, technologists, everybody else to come see what we do have in our landscape with technology. And so, looking at, one thing I'm going to say that, not to like toot our own home, but we're putting our money where our mouth is when we have our partnership with Coursera and others. So we look at like technological breakthroughs, we talk about policy change, but what other collaborations or new ways of thinking could truly accelerate the positive of AI globally?
Yeah, so I think at our federal level, I think we need to find a new model for public-private partnership. I think everybody says this, but it's really hard also to unlock because we have legal, ethical rules in place. But when you compete with China, old models they don't work anymore. And so we have to find a way in which, if the innovation is happening in the private sector at this speed that we're seeing today, how do we make sure that the government is really adopting policies that are relevant and current? And I think that's always going to be tricky in terms of AI. So I think that's the first piece. The second piece is really, we're used to, like you and I worked for a long time in federal government. We're used to people joining federal government and never having the ability to move out and in. And I think that knowledge right now is much fluid. It's much more dynamic. You need to open the doors where people can come in, spend 1 year with the federal government. They bring their technological skills, help HHS or Department of State or CIA with those skills, and then they can go back to private sector. But these models, we've always talked about it. I think AI pushes us and creates a necessity to move to a much more hybrid model, maybe in terms of how you bring people inside the government from the outside. At the international level, I just think that we need to think differently about how do we create a new map of allies and partners And then how do we help our traditional allies and partners that are not there yet in terms of this? You know, for example, you and I went to India last month. India is the one country, I would say this, and I've been saying since my trip there, that sees immense opportunities in the new administration, in the new AI era. They're going all in. They have a scale. They have incredible universities, incredible people, incredible AI applications. They're building some of the biggest data centers in the world. And I think you can sense that positive approach towards AI in India when you go there. Obviously, probably China has that same attitude. It's just unfortunately, you and I are never going to be allowed to go there maybe. India really is a demonstration of having a clear vision about the future, having a clear vision about what this technology can mean for my country, my needs, and my people. And then what can you offer to the rest of the world? Because I think India maybe doesn't have to offer so much to the world in terms of military power or other elements of national power, but in terms of technology, India can clearly play up there with the big boys club.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I've got two questions for you then before I open it up to the audience, and this is like more path ahead type questions. So, you know, we just talked about risks and opportunities, and you look at what's happening right now. What is, like, if you could pick one immediate tangible action for the U.S. to take, or its allies to take in the next 6 to 12 months, what would it be?
I think we need to create a positive narrative about AI. Because this is my biggest concern, is the AI adoption is still not where we need to be. When you look, The Economist had an incredible piece at the beginning of April where they compare AI adoption across public and private sector in China and the United States and the rest of the Western countries. And there is still a big gap in terms of like how we have AI and how we adopt AI. And I think this could be problematic because if AI is that defining, transformative, whatever verb you want to use it for AI, we all agree that this is once in a generation, similar to electricity technology, then the public adoption needs to be much more proactive. I think the government should send signals that, look, we need to reframe the educational piece on this. The healthcare piece will be, I think once we see the first instances of AI solving health issues that we've been struggling for decades because the lack of compute power, the lack of data, or the lack of modeling and testing, I think that's when you're going to see probably a narrative change among people. But right now, in terms of where there's a bigger sentiment and more positive sentiment in terms of AI adoption, obviously China is winning that sentiment. I think government can play a role there because government's job is really to convey to the rest of the country like how and for what reasons we need AI and how we're going to use it and what are the risks and frameworks and safeguards we are putting in place. But I think we have to solve this issue probably in the next 2 to 3 years. Otherwise, we will be in a difficult situation in 2029, 2030 when it comes to AI adoption. We might end up with like a hodgepodge of like states that have adopted some kind of a legal framework, others that have not, for example, in the United States. And then you can see these like revolutionary apps and like educational. There's a school right now that everybody's talking about it. I think it's in Florida. They have adopted AI personal tutors for the kids, and the kids' scores really jumped to the top 5% of the national scores. So like you will hear more and more about these cases of people that are adopting AI for these kind of issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Last question, and this is, of course, the big question everyone always asks. So if you could fast forward to 2035, what does winning the global competition look like in AI for democracies? And then what does losing look like? And this is something we had talked about at NSCAI, and I think that, it's still, the driving force, but, has it changed, or, what is the picture you want to paint?
Oh, that's a lot of $1 million question, Tara, but look, I think that maybe not winning because, as I said, the competition with China is never going to be a zero sum. There will be areas in which they're going to be ahead, and there are areas that we are ahead. But I just hope this doesn't become a zero sum in which, when they win completely, and there's no chance for us even to like recover at all from that loss. And I think that is probably the scenario we should avoid, in which, as you build this digital infrastructure of the future, what are the tiles that you have to put in place that even as they're building their own house and their tiles and they're spreading their technologies in the global south or even in Latin America, that you can still compete and the competition is healthy, because we're competing right now in uneven grounds. They have a government subsidized national AI champions that they deploy them globally. And so when you control the infrastructure, when you control the software, when you control the messaging via TikTok or the AI going forward, I don't think the future will be pretty if they win. I admit the competition will always be close, but that's okay because, you know, China is a serious competitor, as I mentioned. But I hope that we still have, you know, the leading companies, the leading AI models, that we will get first to the artificial general intelligence before the China gets there. Because, you know, we're talking about AI, but when you look at our private sector companies, they're all talking about who's going to get there first in terms of AGI.
Mm-hmm.
I think the one thing that we absolutely need to avoid is letting China get there first.
I agree. Now we just got to do it. Okay.
Somebody.
So Scott, you raised your hand.
Yes, I did. John Daniels wrote in and wanted to know if we could address competition relative to quantum computing. How do those two fit? What's the big play? And I think we're farther ahead in quantum than China. And will that be make a big difference?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So what we did here, we really analyzed 6 technologies, quantum being one of them. You know, people think, oh, we're all focused on AI, but I think China is going all in on all these 6 technologies. And there are semiconductors, AI, energy, quantum, biotechnology, and the advanced networks, so 5G, 6G of the future. China doesn't have like one focus at the time. They've issued a strategy document back in 2017 that has a list of 9 technologies they want to double down and rule the world according, they call it the commanding heights of technology. And quantum is one of them. They've invested a lot of money in building campuses for quantum labs and quantum compute. They've pulled some of the best talented people that we had, you know, that were born in China. They pulled them back, and now they're building the best quantum labs there. But look, the risk about any of these technologies, China getting ahead, is a detrimental risk for our nation. People say like, oh, once they get to the quantum, they'll be able to, you know, get ahead in encryption. They can unlock everything that we have, and etc. But I would argue for any of these 6 technologies, them getting ahead, it will be detrimental for our country because they're so interlinked. And I think quantum, given the sensitivities we have for our communication systems and encryption, is another technology that we should not let China get ahead.
One quick follow-up on that. I know I've served in the Reagan administration and during the Cold War, and the national laboratories were absolutely key to that. National security labs, all labs played a huge role in that. After the end of the so-called end of the Cold War, at least the former Cold War, things settled down, and they began to try to slow down the amount of money they were spending there, and it's had an impact in Lawrence Livermore places like that. But what role are they playing, and are they sufficiently funded and missioned? Is their mission focused on this sort of thing? Do we know what role they're playing?
Yeah, great question, sir. We just hosted the directors of all the labs, and I just interviewed Thomas Mason, the director of Los Alamos lab, for my podcast. When it comes to AI adoption in government, I would tell you the labs are at the forefront of this. They have moved much, much faster. I think also the tech companies have moved faster in working with labs. I know OpenAI has a contract and helping all these labs right now. I think Google is doing the same, and Anthropic. So there's a much more, I think, symbiosis at that level, because I think the scientists and computer scientists have found like the language they can talk to each other and how they can utilize AI for this. I think in terms of funding, this whole discussion right now about funding basic R&D research from the federal government really is going to be hurting them a lot. And I think in one area, I understand, you know, we're looking at cutting federal government budget, but the one area we should not cut funding is really the basic R&D funding. This is where the labs do most of the work. This is where the universities benefit by coming out with the best talented people. That's where the testing can happen and the new innovation ideas come. And so I think if we do that, we will cause ourselves a big harm, you know, that we will probably see it in 5 to 10 years. I don't have to say that China is doing the total opposite of us right now.
Thank you.
So
Tara, I have, if no one else has a question, I do. Ylli, thank you for this. Just outstanding comments and so much clarity. Definitely understand the competition points. But if you're speaking to Western multinationals who, on a couple of other dimensions, they're doing business every day with China, supply chains are still there, that sort of thing. And then on the capital side, I mean, billions of capital flowing back and forth, so that virtually supporting the global economy. So how do you, when you're speaking with Western multinationals, how do you talk about that just in context of all the competition? People, I think, tend to think of it as one-dimensional. It's a race, and who's going to win that particular race? But it's more complicated than that, right?
I mean, that's a great point, Bill. And I recognize that maybe because mine and Tara's background in national security, I tend to look and emphasize more the national security side of this. Look, I believe that decoupling is going to be impossible with China. I would argue that their goal is decoupling, not our goal. If you look at what they have done in the last 10 years, they have decoupled industry after industry so they can build self-sufficiency and be less dependent on the rest of the world. Why building dependency on the rest of the world on them, right? And so I think that is just one thing that we have to recognize, that on the space of critical technologies, when you look at minerals, when you look at infrastructure, when you look at what they have done in building their entire ecosystem, they have clearly pushed towards self-sustainment. And I think we just have to recognize that. Now, when you look at industry, like I remember with Tara, we went to Brussels 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I'm obsessed with EV, so I kept telling the officials in Brussels that you're not seeing, but there's going to be a wave of EVs. They're going to crush your manufacturing base. But I think the Europeans were so focused on the charger that was not included as part of the IRA bill that our Congress passed. And I kept telling them, you're missing forest from the trees here. Because China is going to produce incredible cars, which nobody thought that they can do that, especially coming out of COVID. And look at the news today. More Chinese EVs have been sold in European market than Teslas. When you look across the world, Chinese EVs are the biggest exporters of the world. So they're capable of building these technologies of the future. And I think in those areas, we have to find choke points, not letting them get ahead. Because for our industries and our companies, this is going to be a zero-sum outcome. This is not going to be a place for the second runner-up to the Chinese EVs. Because I think their capability, their scale, and the prices they can push out because of the subsidies are going to be unmatchable. And we just have to have a clearer view of what are the areas that really we have to decouple from them, and what are the areas that we can't decouple. The cheap labor, cheap manufacturing, I think that will always continue there. But when it comes to who is building the future EVs, who is building the future digital infrastructure, AI, quantum, telecom, I think we need to have a clear line there that it should be built by democratic companies, because if we get together, we will have the scale, and we will have the market, and we will have probably the ability to compete more effectively with Chinese.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ylli. We are at 12:30, and I know you have a hard stop, but thank you so much for joining us this morning. As always, love having these conversations with you, and thanks Scott and Bill for kicking this off and having Ylli as your inaugural guest. It was a great way to spend the morning.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ylli. It was amazing. That was a wonderful tour to Horizon. The only problem is Horizon keeps moving beyond us, right? So what an interesting presentation. And you raised a lot of questions. We all want to know more about it. I would just remind everybody that in Washington, if you're in Washington, June 2nd to the 4th, plan to visit the AI Plus Expo. I think that's going to be a mind blower if you haven't. I know it's going to blow my mind. I can just tell you need to see this, because it covers everything, and there's nothing quite like it. So thank you, Ylli, and for doing that. And Tara, thank you for setting this up and for doing such a fine job interviewing. And we'll move on to the next program. Thanks so much. Okay, for our next interview, we've called on our advisory board member, Tom Shanker. director of the George Washington University Project for Media and National Security, a noted author in his own right of widely read books, but particularly the national security bestseller, The Age of Danger, which if you're nervous about things, read that. You really get nervous. But anyway, I would recommend it highly to you. Tom will interview David Sanger, considered to be sort of the preeminent thinker right now and writer on national security in Washington. A 3 times Pulitzer Prize winner, the New York Times national security reporter, author of the bestseller New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. And that is a plural, New Cold Wars. So, Tom, thank you for doing this, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Scott and Bill, and really honored to be part of this launch of the AI Collaborative. It's a great honor as well to interview my colleague and friend, David Sanger. I probably shared more bylines back when I used to be Tom Shanker with David than with anybody else. He is still David Sanger. I only used to be that Tom Shanker. But David, as you said, is a 40-year veteran of the Times with multiple Pulitzer Prizes. He is currently the White House and national security correspondent there, reporting on President Trump, his administration, with a particular focus on foreign policy and the intersection of technology, politics, and superpower conflict. In addition to that wall of Pulitzers, he's an entire shelf of best-selling books to his name. Scott listed them just now, but the most recent one, The New Cold Wars, is an absolutely must-read book if you want to understand where we are and the threats ahead. And I'll just point out the kind of professional David is. As you can tell by his background, he's not at the Times Bureau on Farragut Square today. He is in Italy, but even on vacation, he knocked off a brilliant page 1 story earlier this week about Trump, Putin, and the war in Ukraine. He's just unstoppable. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, great to be with you, Tom. And I am on vacation in Italy, so the background you see is not one of those, Zoom created backgrounds. But I was delighted for the invitation to come and to follow up with Tara and Ylli, and then also to join my friend Tom. So I'm really grateful that you guys are paying so much attention to this topic.
Great, David, let's start with a sort of another tour of the horizon. Your book, The New Cold Wars, talks about Russia and China and sort of A to Z threat. If you would, just for everyone who might not have read it yet, describe the major thesis and finding of the book, and then narrow it down to the impact of AI on these new competitions.
Sure. So the concept of the book is that the United States' greatest intelligence failure of the past few decades, to my mind, was fundamentally misunderstanding where China and Russia were headed. And when I came back from my happy life as a foreign correspondent and joined the Washington Bureau of the Times, joining Tom, I had been in Tokyo for many years. There was just an assumption in Washington that China and Russia would both join the West in their own way, wouldn't become Jeffersonian democracies, but would be edged that way by being integrated in Western systems. For Russia, there was lots of reason to believe that their desire for oil and gas revenue, they were flat on their back, this was back in the Yeltsin period, would force them into this. And actually, the book opens, or the first sort of substantive chapter after you get past an introduction about the Ukraine invasion, with George W. Bush and Putin and Putin's then wife and Laura Bush floating down the Neva River in St. Petersburg one evening, talking about having Russia join the European Union, having Russia perhaps at some point join NATO, the alliance that was created to contain them. And when you go back over that conversation now, and we reconstructed it with the participants in the conversation that day or that evening, it was a beautiful night. I was on the press boat behind, but had enough of my notes from when we were briefly on the main boat. And by the way, that's also where we saw Prigozhin serving them dinner. He comes back later on in the book. It seems remarkable, but that's where we thought we were headed there. For China, there was no sense of a technology threat other than the theft of technology from the US. And really, that only came on a number of years later. And the idea that China would be surging ahead with AI research of its own wasn't even conceived. There was just a sense that they were just dependent on the American technology. And there are many reasons, and we can discuss it in another time, that these assessments went wrong. There were people within the intelligence agencies, a few in the tech companies, who thought this was the wrong way to think about China and Russia, particularly about China as a competitor, but they were pretty well shouted down. And so the first 150 pages of the book basically takes you through how it is that we got this so wrong in so many different places. With our focus on Japan as the main semiconductor competitor, with a series of business decisions, but no national policy that led us to move company by company our most advanced semiconductor production to Taiwan. If somebody had come to you with a business proposition, why don't we take the most valuable single technology we have and move it to an island 100 miles off of the Chinese coast, or as Donald Trump likes to say, 5 miles from China, and put it all in the hands of Taiwan Semiconductor to the point that they make 90 to 95% of the most advanced chips, and certainly the chips needed for AI purposes. You would have thrown them out of your office. You would have thought this was just a crazy idea. The fact of the matter is, the country never took this on as a national security issue. It was a business decision for each individual business. Apple making the microprocessor for the iPhone there, Intel moving much of its production to TSMC. The list goes on. It's all familiar with you. But that's the situation that we find ourselves in today. So what's happened when we got to the Biden administration on this? We can go into this in greater detail, Tom, but I would say that the key elements of the Biden policy as it unfolds in the book, and I take you into the debates and discussions they had there on AI and so forth, was, first of all, to limit the most advanced semiconductors and the ASML machines, the lithography machines that are used to produce, to limit their shipment to China on the basis that we need to slow them down. We need to buy some time. Second, to move a good deal of that production back to the United States, and that's what the CHIPS and Science Act was all about. It was both $52 billion for building the actual semiconductor fabs, a tiny amount of money when you think about the fact that a new fab costs $15-20 billion, which was about the price of the last aircraft carrier we built, the Gerald R. Ford, which I think was $15 billion after all the cost overruns, and that was 10 years ago. And then the science part of the CHIPS and Science Act was the basic research money going into each of the areas, and you were just discussing some of those, that China had put together in the Made in China 2025 project. And of course, they launched that 10 years ago, 2015, and it had all the elements familiar to you. Obviously, AI, advanced semiconductors, long-range battery production, quantum computing, which you were discussing. I caught the end of the last presentation, autonomy, biological sciences, and so forth. And the thought at the time that CHIPS and Science was passed was that it would just be a down payment, that would be a start, and then there would be successors. But there were no successors. And of course, you've seen what's happened to that since.
David, thank you so much. Just because you mentioned it, I wanted to jump ahead from my agenda. Has the program to limit technology to China, to try to get the work back here, NVIDIA elsewhere, has it been a success, a failure, or still too soon to call it?
A little bit too soon to call it. The early investments, which people were trying to avoid using the phrase industrial policy, but let's face it, this was industrial policy in its purest phrase. There was money given, seed money to sort of prompt private investment. The Biden folks would tell you that the $50 billion, not all of which has been spent at this point, created 200 to 300 billion more in investment. You saw Taiwan Semiconductor announce that they were going to build. Intel broke ground on a major facility in Ohio. It's been delayed several times. I was just out there, and it looks like it's probably going to be another 5 years till they get there. There have been a number of others, several in Arizona and New Mexico. And then additional investments since President Trump came in and, would parade in executives, and they would either roll out pre-existing commitments or add on to them with some new ones. And Taiwan Semiconductor did that as well. But let's not kid ourselves. If the Biden best scenario numbers were put together, the advanced chips that they were hoping would be produced in the United States would account for about 20% of the U.S. consumption each year by 2030. And that would mean that 80% are still coming largely from Taiwan. And the question is, if you think about the time period that we are thinking about a possible Chinese move against Taiwan, the window opens in sort of 2027. Do you want to be 80% vulnerable in 2030? I don't think so. And yet I suspect that is probably the situation that we will be in. On the other hand, it's better than not getting it going. And the only disappointment I had in the Biden period was that they couldn't sort of prompt more private investment by moving more quickly. And I think it's a legitimate complaint about the Biden folks that once the CHIPS money came out, they just took way too long to get it going. They blame private industry blames them. They're probably both right in that case.
Utterly fascinating and very worrisome. Bring us up to today. I know that you were in Munich for the annual security conference. In or about that time, J.D. Vance spoke out on AI. The president himself hasn't said a lot of specific stuff. Vance has. Tell us what's going on in the Trump administration. Where are they taking this AI policy?
So the president said almost nothing, and when he has, it's been, pretty vague and talks about the AI and so forth. Vance has got a pretty sophisticated understanding of this stuff from the brief time that he spent in venture capital. He's got a lot of friends in Silicon Valley. He's thought about it hard. So before he went to Munich time, just as you said, he went to the Paris AI Summit and gave his first speech. It was interesting. I flew over with him. I learned a big lesson from that. As somebody who's flown around with presidents for 30 years, do not get aboard Air Force Two. It's so jammed in the back that they still have those little metal cigarette holders or ashtrays built into the arms, but you can't move any of the arms. So you would have thought I would have known that by now after the number of years in my job, but I didn't. But he gave a really interesting speech, and I would say that you guys should go take a look at it. Interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, he said he started it off by noting that the last one who had spoken on AI in Europe for the U.S. had been Kamala Harris as vice president. And she spent most of her time discussing equity in AI and safety in AI. And his opening lines, or one of them, was, the AI future is not going to be won by hand-wringing about safety. It's a direct quote from the speech. I would agree with that. I mean, I think we have spent so much time worrying about the safety factors that perhaps we have not thought so much about the speed at which invention has to happen. But I also think if you pay no attention to safety, you could lose the AI future, just as if you spent no attention to safety for, say, aircraft, a few crashes are going to make people highly hesitant to get on and fly. So you can't ignore safety along the way. He warned that hostile foreign adversaries have weaponized AI software to rewrite history, surveillance on users, censor speech. He didn't say, of course, how to go deal with that. And he said that the regulation of tech companies was so great in Europe that the Europeans were never going to truly catch up. So he was basically saying, let's unleash American industry. I don't think anybody would argue with that, but he never discussed guardrails, even the most basic guardrails. So, you know, what the Biden administration did was set up the AI Safety Institute, for example, within the Department of Commerce. And it was supposed to go look at large language models, evaluate them, and be able to go tell OpenAI or Anthropic, well, this is great, but if you ask it the question, how do I build a chemical or biological weapon based on material I could buy at CVS, it'll answer the question. So let's put some guardrails onto this so that that isn't the case. They agreed, most of the companies, to go submit their LLMs, and they did submit their LLMs for this, and that worked out fairly well. They made the changes, and the AI Institute sort of did its work. When we asked the Vance team, what about guardrails? They said, well, we could imagine a couple would be necessary. But they said, basically, we're not really interested in pursuing guardrails discussions. We want to let the industry do what the industry wants to do. And of course, the industry itself has flipped on this. During the Biden administration, they said, please regulate us, because they wanted to get rid of all of the liability questions. So they figured if they submitted this to the AI Institute, they got the good housekeeping seal of approval on it, and they turned it out. If something went wrong, they could say, well, this was government approved. But now that they recognize where the Biden administration, where the Trump administration is going, their new view is get rid of all our shackles.
Utterly fascinating. You know, still at the strategic level, David, given your absolute expertise in the topic, I'd love it if you could clear some of the background clutter about AI. In the public debate, at least, it goes from risks that are comical to risks that are existential. It's like AI will help me talk to my dead dog in heaven, to AI will bring about the end of the human race. From your perspective, what are the greatest realistic risks brought by AI, and what are the greatest real opportunities in AI and national security?
So in the risk side of this, you know, the problem is we don't know how deep the well is, right? When we've seen AI hallucination, and then we've imagined what happens if you apply the technology to autonomous weapons, you can imagine the weapons being turned on you, right? So that's a significant risk along the way. If you ask yourself the question, what would happen if we use AI to make judgments about when to launch nuclear weapons? Well, no one really thinks that's a terribly good idea. And it's interesting that the one agreement with China that Biden was able to get, and people barely noticed it, at the very end of the administration, was a statement saying we should never use AI to go launch nuclear weapons, which is actually in some ways the wrong question. The right question is, how much do you want to use AI in the analysis of the situation about whether you are going to need to go launch? So in other words, if an AI tool is handing bad information off to a president who's got 12 minutes to decide to launch before you lose your ground-based force or some other part of the nuclear command and control system, then you haven't really saved yourself very much. So that's the sort of worst end. On the more moderate risks, there's some interesting studies. At the last session you were discussing the U.S. labs. I was out at one recently that's examining the question of whether the Chinese, by dropping more sensors into the Taiwan Strait and then using AI techniques to differentiate what they're hearing, may be able to track our most silent subs. Really interesting question, because we have always thought that the way you hide the subs is suppress noise from the engines and all. How many times did you and I write those stories about that competition? But in fact, if you could use other methods, from disturbance in the water to following known tracks that these subs operate in, you could pretty well wipe out everything that we think we know about preserving second strike capabilities. And that's a case of using it somewhat subtly as a tool along the way. There are all kinds of possibilities in disinformation and misinformation, where you could use AI to target specific groups who might be more vulnerable to a certain kind of propaganda. And then, of course, there are all the usual things we've worried about for years now, deep fakes and so forth, some of which are getting pretty good. Fake voices, fake photographs along the way. My biggest concern from a national security viewpoint is what we don't realize it can be used for. In other words, if our intelligence capability fails to detect that the Russians or the Chinese or someone else are using AI to make an advance in some certain area or another. And my confidence level that we'd be able to pick that up is pretty low, considering the fact that we didn't pick up, for example, in our own intel systems, that the Chinese Ministry of State Security had successfully gotten inside all of 9 of our major telecommunications firms with what became the Salt Typhoon attacks. And they're still in there. That's the part that the government doesn't like to tell you. They've never figured out how to roust them. Well, you can imagine how an attack like that could be put on steroids by its use with AI. At the same time, AI is going to help us defend, because particularly in the cyber arena, because we'll be able to detect anomalous activity much more quickly than if you were doing this using more conventional means. And for a long time, Microsoft, for example, thought that AI would help defense more than offense. I think that's still an open question, and probably it's not going to be an even answer. In some places, it'll help offense more, and others it'll help defense more.
Just a footnote for those who object to any thought of AI in the military kill chain. They don't realize that all of the Patriot air defense batteries that we've sent to Ukraine over the past couple of years, all are operated by AI, because no human being with a pad and pencil or a calculator can see an incoming trajectory and figure out where it's going to land in time to launch the interceptor. So humans still have eyes on, but that is an AI system that we've been fielding without controversy for years and years.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Tom, because this gets at a core question in autonomy of the military. So for years, including the time that you covered the Pentagon, and I'll say to the rest of the crowd here, nobody covered the Pentagon like Tom. The slowest way to make progress was to be walking one of the rings of the Pentagon with Tom, because everybody knew him and stopped to chat, which is something that would this is why AI will never replace Shanker as a Pentagon reporter. But one thing that I've noticed in the Pentagon is, for years they said there has to be a man or woman in the loop. Then they changed that to a man or woman on the loop. Pardon me, just a sec. An interesting change. And when you pressed about what that meant, what it meant was the activity back and forth is going to be so quick that you can't have time for a meeting or a human authorization. So what you need to do is have somebody watching to see that the algorithm is playing the way it's supposed to play. Today, when you ask that question, they tell you, yeah, that's still our policy. But the fact of the matter is that, say, in the opening of a conflict with China over Taiwan or something, it would probably play out so quickly that you wouldn't have time to see if the algorithm was still working. And this is something the Pentagon never wants to discuss in public, because the public-facing policy is still the one that, began with these decisions are made by a human being who could be held responsible, who could be court-martialed if you needed to, right? But the fact of the matter is that the more human intervention there is in these systems, the more likely you are to lose in the opening rounds. And of course, we don't think the Chinese or the Russians are necessarily going to care from a legal perspective whether there's a human being in the loop. The Israelis have automated weapons. They had for a long time along the border with Gaza and some in the West Bank prior to the October 7th terror attacks. So we're beginning to see countries edge into this, and drone warfare has been sort of the ultimate example of that. If you need to have the drones be able to operate when disconnected from the network.
Your book, A Perfect Weapon, was all about cyber. It broke so much ground, so many scoops, a powerful book. If you were to rewrite that today, or do a next edition, you alluded earlier, the impact of AI on cybersecurity, on encryption. What new chapters or what new reporting would you want to do in this new AI-driven era?
I've gone back and looked at it and asked myself that question, how would I change the book? And the answer is that while everything in it about cyber, I think, still pretty much applies, including the fact that cyber is a much better short-of-war weapon than a weapon when you get into war, you need an entirely new book to look at the national security challenges of AI. And some of the examples I just gave you are part of that. And that's what worries me a little bit about what we have taken apart in just the past, 120, 130 days of the Trump administration. So most of the misinformation, disinformation, and election-related, thank you. Most of those sections of CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, have been dismantled in large part because the Trump administration has memories of CISA's declaration at the end of the 2020 election that it had been a perfectly fairly run election. And you've seen the actions that President Trump has urged to be taken against Chris Krebs, who was running CISA at the time. But taking apart the misinformation and disinformation parts, at a moment that we're seeing AI beginning to be used to go craft and target those, strikes me as particularly a dangerous step. And it's not just been in CISA. You've seen it at the State Department and elsewhere. It's sort of left the NSA all by itself. And we don't really have a sense of the policy of the NSA because the director of the NSA, who also is the director of U.S. Cyber Command, was relieved of duty while he was in Japan, and he has not been replaced. I mean, there's an acting who's there. So we don't really have a sense of who is going in to go look at AI-driven misinformation, disinformation, or even AI-driven hacking. And I'd like to see a comprehensive plan there. We have heard the new administration say they're going to be much more aggressive about using offensive cyber, but they haven't said toward what end.
Well, I see your next bestseller in the works here. If I could drive this down to the tactical level, the most tactical at all, which is us as individuals. I love that ad that asks, what's in your wallet? Should each of us as individuals fear the day, David, when there's no more encryption? No more cybersecurity. Our bank accounts are open to the world as our emails because AI is just too powerful and too fast.
Well, I think you can worry about it, but I'm relieved by the fact that the Chinese themselves, and they're likely to be the ones to get us to a post-encryption, world of, and that's going to be mostly in quantum computing. Or through quantum computing, they too need a reliable international financial system that is secure. I thought one of the better things that the Biden administration did was a series of executive orders to try to prepare the government for a post-quantum future where encryption could be easily broken. And I think the NSA appeared to make a fair bit of progress in that regard. And that, is a problem for financial services. It's a problem for the nuclear codes, right? So it's throughout. Most of the major financial institutions I've talked to are working hard thinking about what a post-quantum world would look like and how you would handle encryption in that period of time. It's not that all encryption would be gone. The question is, how easily would it be broken? And are there things you can go do with encryption to make them sort of quantum proof? I think we've got a little more time on that. But you would not want to get a strategic surprise in that particular arena.
Mm-hmm. The AI collaborative is open to scholars, researchers, but it's also about C-suite executives and financial and technology companies. As a journalist, David, talk a bit about our profession. How is covering the story of AI and AI itself affecting the relationship between reporters and these high-tech AI companies that they're covering?
It's a really good question, Tom, because it's changed a lot. So the companies, when in startup mode, were incredibly secretive, as you can imagine, not necessarily because they feared reporters as much as they feared their competitors, right? But now they have settled into that sort of second stage where suddenly they've all discovered they need representatives in Washington. They need national security officers. Former student of mine is actually now heading up the national security operations at OpenAI. There's a similar role that they're filling right now at Anthropic. So it sort of reminds me of those days when Bill Gates said, I don't need, lobbyists in Washington. He's now got an army of, I think they spill out of one building into another now in Washington. And obviously in the EU, they've needed that given the rules and so forth. So the good news is they're more aware of the public policy implications. And as a result, it's become clear to them they need to go talk to us. The downside of this, and it reminds me a lot of covering cyber and it's, 10 years ago and so forth, is that a lot of the coverage is geared at either very technical issues or geared for industry insiders. And of course, what we do at the Times and what the Wall Street Journal does and what the Washington Post does and others is try to situate this inside the broader national security questions. And that's why I wrote New Cold Wars. So for China, for example, if in the Cold War they thought containment meant the kind of weapons we were putting around them or how big our Navy was in the Pacific, the new fear of containment is that we won't let them at the ASML machines they need, that we won't let them get them the chips they need. And this has touched off an interesting public debate. Just a few days ago, the head of NVIDIA, Jason Wang, gave a pretty powerful speech in which he said, what have the Biden era restrictions on sending the most advanced NVIDIA chips to China created? It's created more of a motivation in China to design the chips themselves. And therefore, all we have done is sped up their homegrown domestic production. He may turn out to be right. I don't think he's right yet. We haven't seen the Chinese be able to go produce at scale the kind of chips that you're seeing NVIDIA turn out.
Thanks. David, every time we speak, even after all these years, I still learn so much from you. I have one question from myself. I'm sure there's many from the audience. So before we go to the floor, I want to be very parochial and ask you about AI and our profession. There was talk about doing away with copy editors, automatic content, all of that. What do you say as someone who produces news to all of us in the consumer of news world about the impact of AI?
A fabulous tool for reporting, and probably not something you want doing your writing for you or your thinking. We now have a very innovative chief AI officer within the New York Times Company, who is, fabulous at thinking out ahead of these things. And because he knew he had to win us over, he focused some attention on how AI could be used to do our expense accounts, which is the thing that drives reporters the most crazy. I would say it's somewhat disappointing in that regard.
Let me stop you there, though. So if AI is doing reporters' expense accounts, that means it's writing fiction?
That's absolutely, and better than we can. You have to invent those drinks, right? They had about 100 of us use the Google AI products in a test last year, just in our ordinary reporting. It was enormously helpful to sports reporters who had to instantly sort of come up with comparisons, as you can imagine, to, previous records, differentiate, and so forth. It was, I think, somewhat helpful for people who were doing research on the background of a story. I used it, to remind myself of stages of the Iranian nuclear program, for example, where it could put together a pretty good timeline, where I asked it to, filter out certain kinds of things and do this as you would do it with ChatGPT. What was it not useful at? It was not useful at making you think better about what kind of sources would be good for certain topics. It was not good at thinking about confidential sources, people who might know about a topic but didn't know exactly how to go get at it. It was not terribly useful at writing, right? And in fact, we are banned from using it for writing purposes. That isn't to say that these aren't useful at times as a writing lead. As you know, Tom, I teach a national security course with Graham Allison at Harvard, and we always take the final exam, which is a case study course. So it would be a case, and we feed it to ChatGPT or one of the others and just have it take the exam. And what have we learned? That, a good set of algorithms can get a B- easily, probably curved up to a B or B+ in a Harvard graduate course, right? Which, by the way, is better than I did as a student. I would make the point. But we also found that there was no creative thinking to it. It was all listing options that have been tried before or can be taken from other cases. There was no spark of imagination.
Fantastic. Well, if the day ever comes that AI can write a news analysis with the wisdom and grace of yours, then it's time for us all to hang up our hats. But I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Probably not in our lifetime.
Yeah, Scott, do you have some questions from the floor, sir?
Right here from the floor. So, David, thank you so much. That's a brilliant tour de force you just gave us. I'd like to go back for a moment and talk about the non-end of history. Your new book, of course, talks about two, or at least new Cold Wars, and I assume there are two. How different are they, and how dangerous are they? And are they somehow related, or are they really kind of separate wars?
Well, it's a great question. Why is there that S in new Cold Wars? We're obviously engaged in a Cold War with China that's been underway for some time, and both a hot and cold war with Russia, although I would say more cold now, and particularly now that President Trump has shown that he's not really interested in pursuing the Ukraine element of this and would like to get on to a bigger and broader relationship with Russia again, a normalized relationship. But the most important single thing that has happened in the geopolitical space over the past 3 or 4 years, in my view, is the coming together of Russia and China, right? Putin and Xi have had more than 70 meetings since Xi came in. Xi refers to Putin as my best friend. I'm not sure how sincere he is about that.
Good or bad.
Certainly, Putin is deeply, deeply in China's debt for the technology that they've needed to go rebuild the Russian military in recent times. They are also exercising together in, the physical space for their navies and so forth. What we don't know is the degree to which they are cooperating, if at all, in the cyber and AI arenas. They have a lot of distrust for each other, but they have a mutual goal in trying to frustrate the United States. And I think they recognize that in the nuclear arena, in the AI arena, certainly just in the number of ships they can deploy in the Pacific, they make life vastly more complicated for the US if we believe that they are planning and training together. And eventually that's going to move into the technology space. Now, I don't think the Russians have the capability to keep up with the Chinese in this arena, particularly with the commercial products, but they may well see the same advantages in the technology space to challenge us militarily that they do in the hardware space.
So is there a reverse Kissinger going on here with Trump? Is that a real thing, or does it make any difference? I often doubt that the Chinese ultimately will share any of their really superior AI type technology with anybody, let alone Russia. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't think they're going to share their highest end. I don't think the Russians would know how to go use it. So the reverse Kissinger is a really interesting phrase. So, of course, Kissinger said that the real purpose of the opening to China was to separate out Russia and China. That was at a time when Russia and China had been at each other's throats. They had had some border wars. So there was a divide for us to exploit. I don't see that right now. There may get to be one. Biden certainly thought these two could not work together at the beginning of his presidency. He said as much to me when I asked him during a press conference about a year into his presidency. At his last press conference, which was after the NATO meeting in July of last year, I asked him if he had developed a strategy to go deal with Russia and China coming together. And he said, yes, we have, but I won't tell you what it is. And actually, I think keeping it secret was probably one of the biggest mistakes that the Biden administration made at the end, because we have no way of comparing what their strategy was to what Trump's may be. The one who's made reference to this reverse Kissinger approach of using a rapprochement with the Russians to split them off from the Chinese is Secretary Rubio. It's an interesting thought, but I don't see any evidence that it's working. I mean, the Russians may distrust the Chinese, but they obviously distrust us more. The Russians have increased their dependency on China, particularly for technology. They have no illusions that even if they get a normalized relationship with President Trump, that the U.S. is going to begin shipping significant high technology to Russia any more than we would ship it to China. So I don't see the reverse Kissinger approach working.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah, I hope so. Any other questions?
Tom, can I? Yeah. Unless there's a question from the audience, I don't want to jump in front of anyone. But David, thank you. And talked a lot about chip production and the dynamics in the global market around all that. What are some thoughts on the energy side and the compute side? We hear so much about the data centers and how many hundreds of billions are going into constructing these data centers. And yet, there's only so much the electric grids can take in the first place.
Yeah.
So thoughts on that, the dynamics there?
Well, first of all, I thought it was a good move for the president to begin to think about building some of those data centers in the Mideast. And they're obviously going to have a big incentive to create the energy to go do it. I think the experiments that are underway with different kinds of nuclear reactors in the U.S. are helping with that, as long as they remain proliferation resistant. And I think that problem we know how to go solve. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of those data centers are going to have to be outside the U.S. because, as you say, our grid just can't take it. And that is inconsistent with President Trump's desire to move all this manufacturing back to the U.S. And when I ask the question, can somebody square the circle for me here, and explain how in moving all of this back, we're going to have the energy to produce it? They just say, we're working on it. We're sure it won't be a problem, but they don't tell you how. I really don't see how you do this without putting those data centers outside the U.S. into places where you have renewables that can feed them and so forth. Fortunately, the Chinese have the same problem.
Okay.
Okay, I've got a question from Joyce Hackman at Chatham House. How concerned are you about non-state actors using advanced AI capabilities to conduct cyber operations that might have an impact on national security? And let me see, I can see more. And how should governments deal with this threat?
So it's a really great question, because, as we begin to get more and more powerful commercial models out there, the price of entry for terror groups, other non-state actors, is going to get lower and lower and lower, right? And, the first model to look at here is not conventional terrorism, it's ransomware. Think of who's driven ransomware. It's been gangs, right? Many of them in Russia, but not all of them in Russia, a lot of them in Eastern Europe, a lot around the world. And, I think one of the big failures of the Biden era is that President Biden came out after the Colonial Pipeline attack in 2021, I think it was late 2021. That's what prompted his one meeting with Putin in Geneva, and basically said, you've got to crack down on this happening in your territory, because we can't tolerate this going on. And if you don't, you're going to pay a significant price for it. Well, the ransomware problem is vastly bigger today than it was in 2021. And the Russians and other states that harbored these groups and sometimes encouraged them have paid almost no price for this. So it is a big worry that we are handing them a significant tool. And that gets back to the guardrails question that we opened up with, which is when you have AI systems, you want to think about guardrails that not only would keep you from building chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons, but would make it more difficult or more traceable if you use them to build cyber weapons, if you use them for ransomware purposes, if you use them to try to hide the transfer of cryptocurrencies, which is almost entirely how ransomware, is sustained. And that's an example of where I think we're going to need to go focus on safety, whether the Trump administration thinks that's hand-wringing, as to use J.D. Vance's phrase, or not.
David, do you think the hand-wringing allegation had any merit about the Europeans that Vice President made?
Yeah, look, when he gave that speech, the first thing he did was he dropped AI into an America First context. He said, we're out to dominate this technology. That doesn't mean you can't ride along as our junior partner. And then he made the point that of all the major AI companies, the number of them that are based in Europe is 0.
Okay, thanks.
And he was right about that. And I think that was something of a wake-up call for the Europeans. And I do believe that their focus on regulation has probably meant that if you're creating an AI company today, if you think you've got the next open AI concept, You're not going to base it in Europe. You'd be crazy to go do that. And Macron has recognized this, and that's why he's rolling back some of his regulations as well. I suspect not fast enough. So I do think that there was some legitimacy in his argument, but I would feel better about it if I understood what they think guardrails are supposed to go do, right? Because the last thing you'd want to do is build a large language model that then help the North Koreans solve the last problems they have for getting an intercontinental ballistic missile that can hit Chicago.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions? This has been a terrific run here, and thank you for doing this all the way from Italy. I can't say that I feel sorry for you or anything.
I found very few people have been feeling sorry for me, Scott, along the way here. But I'm delighted to have joined you guys. And just finish with one last thought. One of the debates you hear in Washington a lot these days is, do we have to worry about safety first, or do we have to worry about basically racing against the Chinese for the domination of this technology, which is a topic that came up in the previous session. And my answer to that is superpowers don't get a choice, right? We had to learn how to build nuclear weapons and stay ahead of the Soviets. We also had to learn how to build PAL systems on them, permissive active action links, so that they weren't taken over by a rogue operator or by a foreign country and launched without our knowledge, right? It was not a race that we didn't think we could lose the arms race. And we also didn't think that we could leave nuclear weapons around for anybody to launch. And I don't think that this is any different. We don't have the luxury of choice here about picking safety or speed.
Of course, in the nuclear arms race and in that whole period, we got everything was classified. We were national laboratories doing so much of it. There were certainly private sector players, but they were locked into the industrial, the military industrial state.
Not
today, and we see so many challenges because I think the high tech industry is kind of the one that needs to do most of this work, not government, and they don't really want they want protection if they don't want regulations, and it seems to be we're in a twist on that one.
We are a bit in a twist on that, and that's why I think I'd go back and look at the AI Safety Institute model, because while they didn't want regulation, they did want somebody to put that good housekeeping seal of approval that I mentioned on the large language model, in part because if something went wrong, they wanted to be able to say to a judge, we ran this by the government and they approved it through their regulatory process. Right. It's just we can't make that process so cumbersome that it sits on the innovation.
So Scott, since we have 4 minutes left, I will ask a last question that grows from this, David. You've written for years so thoughtfully about nuclear deterrence, some about cyber deterrence, and now AI. Does the deterrence model work anymore, or what has to be changed?
So even in cyber, before AI became a central issue, I basically took the position that every question that came up in nuclear deterrence also comes up in cyber, right? How to create incentives to stop states or non-state actors from using this weapon. But that in cyber versus nuclear, the answers were all different. Scott got at one of the reasons for that, right? I mean, in the nuclear world, we still have 9 nuclear states. It's astounding. It's just down at that number. We understood everything we needed to know about who had launch authority in the old Soviet Union. We had hotlines for them and all that. None of that applied in cyber. And what we've learned in the cyber age is we have yet to come up with a deterrent model that works. That's why ransomware is rampant, right? That's why we're still seeing Salt Typhoon Typhoon and Volt Typhoon and so forth. The Chinese have no problem. They haven't suffered much at all from being deeply inside our telecom system or inside our utility grid and so forth. And I think that's why you're hearing this movement within the Trump administration to come back and go on the offense more. I applaud that particular effort. But, Bob Gates your favorite defense secretary, used to have this great phrase, the 3 words least used in Washington, and then what? And if we don't have our cyber defenses together in order, you're not going to use your cyber offense because you're going to think this one step out farther. The same applies in AI. I think, our inability to come up with deterrent theory that works in cyber should be a warning to us about AI.
Well, David, thank you so much. I can answer the and then what for you. I'm hoping it's Campari and soda because I see the sun, the sun
the
going
sun
down.
Is setting. We're beginning to think about dinner here tonight. Yes.
Yeah. But David, again, we've been having this conversation together for 40 years. I always learn so much. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to Scott and Bill for hosting this wonderful discussion today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Tom. And I think we should travel anywhere to hear you two talk. That's quite a conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Well, just before we roll this up, I do want to talk a little bit about what we're doing with the Chatham House, what they're doing for us, really, and for the world. They're conducting a comprehensive survey of AI policies, rules, and regulations globally, which will become the centerpiece of our Washington conference. And Joyce Hockman has been leading that charge. And what we're thinking about is, and what I think this will really be, in a way, a map, a dynamic map of the AI world, if you will, a map for navigating global markets, global jurisdictions, and competing national security regimes. I don't think there's anything like that right now. And so we're very excited about this project. And so I wanted to turn next to Dr. Joyce Hockman, who is the Deputy Director of the International Security Program at Chatham House. She is a remarkable person, as you'll see, and does a wonderful job working with us, and has been a great partner for us. And she has with her Katja Bego, who is the Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House's International Security Program, and she's co-editor of the Cyber Policy. So thank you very much for joining us, and share with us a little bit about what you're thinking and what y'all are going to do, because I think it's going to be rather important given what we've all heard today.
Thank you very much, Scott, and it's great to see you and Bill, and it's great to be part of this initiative. We have been working very strongly together for the last 2 years, and we're very excited to be part of the AI Collaborative. And judging by this first salon, I know that this will be a very strong effort, and it will be very beneficial for these different stakeholders that we are trying to reach. And as you mentioned, Scott, our main job in this collaborative is to develop this report. We've heard from the different speakers covering competition, geopolitics, security, technology, infrastructure, which, for C-suite thinking about their own businesses can be quite overwhelming and can be, can feel a little bit bitty. And what we wanted to do is basically put together a report that looks at all these aspects together and try to kind of make sense of the landscape holistically. What does it mean, the US-China competition for, sort of like international players, like for big businesses operating in China, operating in other parts of the world? What are sort of some of the security implications that we are concerned about? How is AI being used in conflict? What are the ethical discussions? But also, how do we make sure that we have the right infrastructure in order to build the AI that we need, that has so many opportunities and transformative opportunities for our world and our societies? So we wanted to put together this report. We're calling it for now, Navigating AI Governance and Security Global Perspectives. And as the name suggests, this report will basically do sort of like 2 things. It will, the essential point is kind of trying to make sense of all these developments, cutting, through the noise, and doing 2 things. One is retrospective and one is forward looking. So in the retrospective, we will look at what have been the major events in the last year. that have defined and shaped AI. You know, a lot of the kind of the themes that have emerged from the discussion today will be there, you know, on the security front, on the tech front, on the geopolitics front. But also we want to look forward and say, okay, where do we think this technology is heading? What is real? What is hype? You know, what risks should we anticipate? Where do we think there are opportunities for collaboration? Or where are some, you know, leadership is emerging beyond US and China? Because we know there are lots of like middle powers with quite impressive initiatives, be it in the Gulf states and South Korea and other parts of the world, in India, etc., that are doing quite interesting stuff. So we wanted, as you said, to kind of map those out and really see what they are. But we also wanted to kind of, you know, reflect on what might be the risks of confrontations that AI might bring. So this paper really, like what we hope to do with it is equip senior decision makers, particularly in the C-suite kind of sector, sort of equip them with clear and actionable understanding of some of the key security and geopolitical trends that are shaping the AI landscape. And we've done some thinking about how we want to structure this report and what would be actually relevant, because there's a lot of information and we don't want to, you know, write like a 50,000 word report that no one will read. So we've been, you know, putting some thinking into what makes sense. And my colleague Katia will talk a little bit about how we're planning to structure this report. But just to kind of, before I turn to her, I just want to say we're extremely excited about this opportunity, about working with you again, but also being part of this great collaborative. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh. Okay. Thank you very much, Joyce. My name is still in a duplicate. Thank you very much as well, Bill and Scott, for the invitation and for inviting us to such a great and very rich conversation today at this first salon. So indeed, as Joyce mentioned, we're delighted to be working with the Howard Baker Forum and the AI Collaborative on this report. So I know we've been hearing a lot of great ideas today, so I'll keep it quite brief, but to give you a brief snapshot of what we are trying to achieve with the report, I'll walk you through the three different sections. So as Joyce mentioned a bit, we really see the kind of meat in this report in trying to surface those sort of geo-economic, geopolitical and security dynamics and how they intersect. And then specifically also look at how different countries are trying to basically address or navigate that increased entanglement. So moving a little bit beyond that sort of US-China binary, which is of course a sort of driving main force driving a lot of this competition. But then there's a lot of really interesting things happening elsewhere as well, and different strategies and different ways in which countries are trying to find their place in this quite revolutionary and I think quite uncertain moment as well, of kind of trying to understand this AI future. So to briefly walk you through the three parts. So as Joyce mentioned, we initially will take this quite holistic view, trying to surface the most important trends and dynamics over 2025, and sort of understanding at quite specific events. So we'll have the first of the AI summits taking place out of the traditional West in India this year, a big moment. We also see a lot of innovation coming out of different places. We see a lot of course, the sort of larger geopolitical trends and tensions spill over into the AI domain itself. So think of sort of export controls and tariffs, etc., which will naturally really impact the AI environment. So primarily when we look at that sort of both retrospective and sort of red line or threads, if you will, throughout the report, consider three main trends. So first is that idea of kind of strategic competition and national security focus in the AI space. And it's something we've, of course, been discussing a lot today as well. So but it's quite clear that the competition over AI is increasingly taking on quite a, say, national security dimension. So, of course, for the US, this is a lot of this strategic competition with China is really framed towards also winning the AI race, which is increasingly become, of course, a national security objective as well, sort of in preventing China from accessing some of the most high-end AI capabilities, not just as sort of economic competition element, but also sort of about military supremacy, if you will. Similarly, Beijing also really sees winning the AI race, of course, or kind of mastering AI as a key ingredient to kind of help facilitate its rise as a power. It's interesting as well that we particularly see a lot of recently is a lot of countries are also taking that moment, or maybe not China and the US, to sort of develop their own sovereign approaches, maybe trying to beacon themselves off or try to articulate their own visions for AI. There taking that sort of resilience and national security lens. That's well. So major trend we're really keen to dig into a bit more. Second one is this idea of the kind of increased militarization or securitization, if you will, of AI development. Is we both see a lot of companies that traditionally maybe not really active in a sort of national security domain, really seeing now the opportunities that AI can offer in that sort of context as well. So we see a lot of dual use deployment. We see governments and militaries also increasingly turn to seeing what are traditionally actually commercial technologies and bring them into the military domain. You've seen a lot of that in Ukraine. In Gaza, we see a lot of that now in forward planning. This will be particularly interesting as we see Europe, the US, several other places really make it strong, particularly in Europe now, of course, investments in rearming and trying to leverage technology really here as a sort of multiplier in times of maybe otherwise fiscal constraint and limitations. And then that will naturally have an impact not just on the security domain, but more generally, as we have the usual tendency, right, that innovation that happens in the kind of national security sector tends to flow into the more commercial realm as well. So it's important to understand those dynamics. And a third key trend, which is a larger one, but will really drive the AI space as well, is this increased sort of fragmentation, global fragmentation that we see happening. And I mean, it's maybe too soon to sort of call for the end or say that we've reached the end of globalization, but something is changing there, and we will see a bifurcation in various ways. And we see this already happening. We see this fragmentation in the AI space really happen across 3 dimensions, I would say. So it's this idea of technical fragmentation. So different countries are really using quite different methodologies for using AI, building systems that might not even work across borders anymore, which would be quite a radical moment if we see that happen. We see regulatory fragmentation as well, with countries taking increasingly different approaches to how they develop, kind of how they regulate AI, increasingly also putting up barriers to solutions, AI solutions, preventing them from entering their markets if they don't adhere by their rules. And then lastly, also, and this I think is maybe the most important one in a way, or at least the most present one currently, is this economic fragmentation. So think here of export controls, sort of maybe protective industrial policy to kind of fund some of the underpinnings of AI and the like, and bifurcation of AI supply chains, etc., which could be part of a larger kind of fragmentation of the technology sphere into quite distinct blocks where we might not even be able to use each other's solutions anymore. So out of this, we are studying in a holistic way, but in the second part of the report, really, as Joyce mentioned, zoom in some of these, zoom in other regions that are maybe less well studied, or well studied, but perhaps not always through this lens, and understand how they're navigating this quite complex and uncertain landscape. So I think here, so we're specifically, with this, very welcome to have your feedback here as well. Keen to look at Europe here, the Middle East, and well, the Gulf countries were mentioned. I think they're really interesting in kind of navigating, positioning themselves as swing states in all of this, now particularly the kind of AI diffusion rule being withdrawn, massive investments in new data centers and the like. So how are they navigating this? East Asia as well, particularly looking at Japan, Taiwan and South Korea, and then India as a key case study too. And then the final part, and I'll end here, is that we'll look at 2026 and beyond as well in this report. So if we look at all these intersecting dynamics that are really shaping the environment, what is it that business leaders and other decision makers need to be thinking about today, and how that might impact their ability to sort of bring AI into their businesses and into their business flows. So very much welcome your reflections and perspectives as well over the year as we continue to develop this report. And thank you very much as well, Bill and Scott, for this excellent first salon. I thought it was really, really great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you both, and thank you for your work you're doing. And I think we have a lot to look forward to. You can see it's obviously very simple, but the challenge will be actually trying to explain it in simple terms, right? But we're looking forward to all working with you and appreciate your support and help so much. So to kind of wrap us up, turn over to Bill, and we'll close out, and thank everyone who's in listening for joining us today.
Yeah, we'll close pretty quickly here. Just 2 quick things. We're going to begin our membership outreach in earnest now, and so we'll be reaching out to many of you. But in the meantime, feel free to reach out to either Scott or myself, and we'll be happy to talk with you. Also wanted to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors. We already have a number of sponsors. We know there are a few more that are in the wings who will be coming in soon, but let me just give you the 5 that we have at this point to thank them. And the first is KHNP, which is Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power. We have MUFG Investor Services, Willis Towers Watson, Andersen, and Baker Donaldson. So I want to thank them, and thanks again to everyone that attended and all the speakers and presenters. Really appreciate it.